Never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd keep secrets from her husband. That's how all these stories start, right? The person insists. They aren't that kind of person. But I wasn't. Or at least I didn't think. I believed in love. Loyalty and the quiet, comfort of a steady life. For 12 years, I was proud of the marriage I had with my husband Daniel. We were that dependable couple, never too flashy, never too dramatic, just solid, grounded, ordinary in a way that people often admired from afar. But sometimes, ordinary isn't enough to hold a person together, and that's something I had to learn. The hard way. Daniel and I met in college. He was the classic good guy, steady, thoughtful a bit, shy. He wasn't the guy who turned heads when he walked into a room, but he'd this dependable warmth to him, like a lighthouse on a foggy night. I fell hard. While others were dating athletes or ambitious dreamers, I chose the guy who always remembered my coffee order and walked me back to my dorm after late night study sessions. We married a year after graduation. Life started quickly after that. Jobs, a mortgage, 2 kids, and a dog named Cooper. We built a life that looked beautiful. On the outside. Inside it was comfortable, predictable. And I thought that was enough. I wanted it to be enough. But things started changing slowly, like a crack in a window you don't notice until the cold air starts creeping in. It wasn't any one thing. Daniel didn't turn into someone cruel or unrecognizable. He was still him, kind, responsible, good with the kids. But somewhere along the way, we stopped. Really seeing each other, he came home from work, exhausted often mentally. Somewhere else, and I found myself going through the motions. Breakfast, laundry, school, pickups, dinner, dishes, sleep, repeat. I kept thinking this is just a season, we'll find our way back. But weeks became months, and months became years. I tried to talk to him, I really did. There were nights I would bring it up gently. I'd say things like, "Do you ever feel like we're just roommates?" And he'd give me a tired smile and say, "It's just been a long week, babe. We'll plan something fun soon." But the soon never came. Life kept moving, and we kept drifting. Then came the book club. It was a suggestion from my friend Marissa Shethot. I needed something something outside the house, outside the routine. So I joined Thursday nights once a month, a small group of women, and unexpectedly one man would meet at a local bookstore cafe. We talked books, drank wine, and shared pieces of our lives. That man's name was Jack. Jack was divorced, probably mid-40s and a bit of an odd fit in the group, but he was charming in a quiet, intelligent sort of way. He didn't dominate conversations, he listened. He made thoughtful observations about the books we read and occasionally about life. He wasn't flirtatious, not in the way you'd expect, but there was something about the way he made eye contact that made you feel like he was actually listening, actually present. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was nice to talk to someone who seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, but I wasn't thinking about him outside those meetings. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Then one night, after a heated discussion about a character's choices in a novel, I found myself staying behind. A few extra minutes to talk to Jack. It wasn't about the book anymore. It was about life, about marriage, about feeling like you're slowly becoming invisible. He didn't press or pry. He just listened. That became a pattern. Every book club meeting ended with a quiet, lingering conversation. Nothing inappropriate, nothing even remotely suggestive, but it felt like something was blooming underneath, like a seed that had been planted and was just starting to reach for sunlight. I didn't tell Daniel about Jack, not because anything had happened, but because I knew the why behind it all would be hard to explain. Because I was starting to think about Jack in between meetings. I found myself looking forward to Thursdays, not for the books, not for the wine, but for the chance to feel seen again. One Thursday it was raining. Not just a drizzle, a full-blown thunderstorm. Jack offered me a ride home since my car was across the street, and I hadn't brought an umbrella. It felt innocent enough. But when I sat in his passenger seat, I noticed how quiet it was. How still no car seats in the back, no snack wrappers, no evidence of a life that demanded every second of his time. He sked, "Do you ever miss quiet?" And I said, "I miss being." That was the first time I felt the lines start to blur. The car ride lasted only 7 minutes, but the silence after I got home was deafening. Daniel was asleep on the couch TV, still glowing remote loosely in hand. I stood there and watched him wondering when we stopped sharing real moments, wondering if he would have even noticed if I hadn't come home at all. I told myself I wouldn't accept another. Righty told myself it was nothing. But 2 weeks later it happened again. This time it wasn't raining. This time I chose to let him drive me. The conversations got deeper. Still nothing physical, but emotional. Oh yes, Jack saw right through the wall I had built to keep everything inside. He asked questions Daniel hadn't asked in years. What makes you happy? What do you need that you're not getting? Why were you before all this? He remembered details not just about me, but about the things I said in passing. He noticed when I wore my hair differently, when I laughed too hard at a joke, when my eyes lingered on a sunset outside the cafe window. And I began hiding things, small things at first. When Daniel asked how book club went, I'd give short answers. I didn't mention Jack. I stopped leaving my phone out in the open, not because there were messages there weren't, but because I was afraid of how interested I'd become in hearing from him. It's hard to describe the guilt that comes when nothing technically wrong has happened, but, something very wrong is beginning to grow. I hated the secrecy, but I also craved the connection. I was split down the middle, and neither side was winning. I remember the night. Everything shifted. It was a Thursday, of course. We were discussing a novel about betrayal, ironically, and if Jack and I stayed behind again. He looked at me, really looked, and said, "You don't have to keep pretending you're okay." I think I held my breath for a full minute before whispering, "I'm so tired, Jack. I don't even recognize myself anymore." And then just like that, he ached out and held my hand. No words, just a quiet understanding in his eyes, and that was the first physical contact. Simple, brief, but it felt seismic, like a door opening that I wasn't sure I could close. Again, I didn't sleep that night. I sat in our guest bedroom staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what I had become. I loved my husband, or at least I loved the man I married. But somehow in all the chaos of life, we had lost each other. And in that empty space, someone else had stepped in and filled the silence. I wasn't proud of what I was feeling. I wasn't trying to justify it, but I couldn't deny it anymore. I was falling for someone who wasn't my husband. And I had no idea what to do next. I don't know how many times I thought about telling Daniel, not because I wanted to hurt him, and not even because I wanted to confess. Exactly, I think I was just desperate for him to see me again. For him to look up from his emails or the evening news and notice that I was unraveling right in front of him. But the timing never felt right. There were always things happening. The kids' school projects, grocery, lists, a work, trip he had to prepare for a leaky faucet. Life doesn't pause for emotional chaos. And when I did try to inch toward that space to drop hints, he seemed to interpret my sadness as stress. His solution was always to try fixing things, practically. "You need a day off," he'd say, or, "Why don't I watch the kids this weekend and you go out with Marissa?" He was trying in his way, but it felt like he was missing the point entirely. Meanwhile, Jack was becoming more than just a presence in my Thursdays. He was texting me now. Simple things like a quote from the book we were reading, or asking for my opinion on something. But his messages made me feel awake, alive. Even I'd catch myself smiling when I saw his name on my screen, then quickly tucking the phone. out of sight like a teenager hiding notes in class. One afternoon after dropping the kids off at a birthday party, I parked a few blocks away and just sat there in my car. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to face the kitchen counters stacked with dishes or the laundry baskets or the vacuum lines in the carpet that Daniel always thought meant everything was just fine. I sat there in silence, staring at the dashboard. Then, without really thinking, I called Jack. He answered on the second ring. "Hey," I said. My voice cracked a little. "Are you free?" There was a pause. "Yeah." He said, "You okay?" I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "I don't know, I just didn't want to be alone right now." He told me to come by. He lived in a small apartment above a flower shop downtown. It wasn't romantic or dramatic, just simple, clean quiet. I didn't go inside. We sat on a bench near the entrance, drinking coffee and watching people walk by. It was cold, but I didn't feel it. We talked about nothing and everything. He didn't push. He never did. That was part of why it was so easy to be around him. He made space for the parts of me that felt too messy to show. Anyone else, I asked him once why he kept coming to the book club surrounded by women who often talked over him Hesmeled and said because every once in a while someone says something real, and I think that's rare. I think I knew in that moment that he meant me, and that terrified me. I went home that night and lay in bed. Next to Daniel, I stared at the ceiling. Just like I had the week before, I could hear his soft breathing, the occasional twitch in his leg, the way he sighed when rolling over. I thought about how much history was wrapped up in that. One bed, 2 kids. One miscarriage, countless. Arguments, holidays, apologies, dreams once whispered under the covers. And yet in that moment I felt like I was lying next to a stranger. It's a strange thing to feel lonely while being so physically close to someone. The guilt started to eat at me in new ways. I started pulling away from Jack. I stopped replying to some of his texts. I made excuses after book club, said I had to get home early, avoided lingering. I hoped that if I could just cut things off before they went too far, I could patch things up with Daniel. Maybe all I needed was tour focus, but life doesn't clean up that neatly. Jack noticed. Of course he did. One night after book club, he caught up with me in the parking lot. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "Numbera, it's not you. It's just everything." He stood there for a second, his hands in his pockets watching me. "I care about you," he said. "But I don't want to make your life harder. If walking away is what you need, I'll respect that." I didn't answer. I just nodded and got in my car. But as I drove home, tears streamed down my face. Because for all his flaws, and I'm sure there were many, ik knew. Jack saw me, and I was the one who'd let him in. I had crossed the line even. If I tried to convince myself otherwise. At home, things were strangely still. Daniel was working late again. The kids were asleep. I stood in the kitchen, staring at our fridge covered in school magnets and grocery lists and coupons. I kept meaning to use what was I even doing? The next day, I asked Daniel if we could go away for the weekend, just the 2 of us. He was surprised, but agreed. Quickly, I told my mom we needed help, watching the kids. She raised her eyebrows but didn't press. We drove to Akabin in the mountains, something rustic and quiet. No TV, limited cell service, just us. It was awkward at first. We didn't know how to talk to each other without the buffer of routine. But then, one night by the fire, I finally said what had been building in me for months. "Don't know if we're happy anymore," I whispered. He stared at the fire for a long time before answering. "I've been afraid to ask that same question." We talked that night, really talked about the distance, the silence, the way we had both been living side by side without really sharing the same life. He admitted he'd been overwhelmed at work, scared. losing his job. He'd been trying to hold everything together and didn't realize he was shutting me out. I told him about how lonely I'd been. I didn't mention Jack, not by name, not then. But I told him I had been looking for connection in places I shouldn't have, that I had let someone else fill a void that we'd both been ignoring. He didn't yell. He didn't storm out. He just sat there, eyes red, nodding slowly. "We can fix this," he said, "if we both want to." And I wanted to. I really did that weekend. Didn't fix everything, but it cracked the door open. Again. We started having coffee together. In the mornings, just 10 minutes before the chaos of the day, we started sharing little things, memories, music, laughter. It wasn't perfect. I still thought about Jack sometimes in quiet moments, but I chose not to see him again. I even stopped going to book club, told Marissa I needed a break. She didn't ask questions. Maybe she suspected something. Maybe not. But she didn't push Daniel. And I started therapy. Not because of a crisis, but because we realized we'd been coasting for too long. And if we were going to find our way back, we needed help. There were hard conversations. There were tears. There were moments when I wondered if it was too late, but there were also moments of laughter, of tenderness, of rediscovery. One night while washing dishes, Daniel looked at me and said, "You look lighter lately," and I realized I felt lighter. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had stopped, pretending I had started choosing honesty even when it was painful. Jack faded into the background. He never reached out again. I don't know what he thinks of me now. Maybe he thinks I used him. Maybe he understands. Maybe he'll let go too. But what I do know is that I learned something important. Affairs don't always start with desire. Sometimes they start with silence, with long stretches of emotional neglect, with feeling invisible. But healing starts with truth, with choosing to turn toward instead of away, with deciding that the love you built is still worth the work it takes to save it. And for me, it's been almost a year since all of that happened, and I still think about it more often than I probably should not, because I miss it, or because I wish things had turned out differently, but because it changed me. It forced me to face parts of myself I had ignored for too long. My loneliness, my resentment, my need to be seen not just as a wife or mother, but as a person with her own heart. Daniel and I are in a better place now. Not perfect, but better. We've rebuilt slowly and honestly. There are still days when we slip into old habits, when the silence creeps in, but recognize it. Now, we talk more, we listen, more. We check in. Some wounds don't disappear completely, but they fade and they teach. I never told Daniel the full truth about Jack. Maybe one day I will if it ever feels necessary. But for now, I've made peace with what happened. Not because it was right, but because it was real, and it woke me up. And sometimes waking up is the first step toward finding your way home again.